All right, welcome to the deep dive, where we like to really dig into the big ideas from, all that stuff you want to understand. We try to take those complex topics and make them, hopefully make them a little bit easier to grasp.
Yeah.
And maybe, spark a few of those aha moments for you along the way. You're the kind of person listening to this who wants to get informed, but you don't want to wade through a ton of, extra stuff. So today we are diving deep into a really cool collection of letters, and it's called The 38 Letters from J.D. Rockefeller to His Son. You can think of this as sort of like a guided tour through the mind of one of the titans of industry, really.
Yeah, our mission today is to go beyond just a simple summary of these 38 letters. What we really want to do is sort of unpack how Rockefeller thought about the world, his fundamental beliefs about success, and the practical lessons he was trying to pass on to his son. We'll try to do this in a way that feels both insightful and also relevant to you, the listener.
All right, so before we even get to the first letter, there's this fascinating note from the person who compiled all these letters. It talks about the ups and downs that everyone faces in life, and how it's super important to read these letters with, an open mind, which I think is a good reminder that even someone as successful as Rockefeller, I mean, come on, the guy was a legend, but even he had his own, set of challenges to navigate.
Oh, for sure. And it really sets the stage for understanding this core conviction that Rockefeller had, this belief that our destiny, it's not determined by where we start, but by the choices we make, by the actions we take, right? And he's a great example of this himself. I mean, he came from very humble beginnings. He even talked about how, as a kid, he struggled to even afford school books, but he went from being a $5 a week bookkeeper to building this huge oil empire. I mean, it's kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah, I mean, it is really incredible when you think about that trajectory. He saw his achievements as a direct result of hard work and perseverance, and that's a theme that really pops up throughout these letters right from the get-go. I mean, letter number one, and it's a really empowering message for anyone who's feeling stuck or limited by their current situation. You know what I mean?
It definitely is. And that brings us to the very first letter, dated January 20, 1900, and it's titled Planning Luck. And this is where Rockefeller tackles this whole idea of luck, and his perspective might surprise you because he doesn't really see luck as this random, uncontrollable force.
Right. And he starts off by looking at people who seem to be destined for success, right? Like they have this extraordinary talent, or they were just born into fortunate circumstances. And he specifically mentions Mr. McCormick, the guy who invented the harvester. Rockefeller clearly admired him. Yeah. He was impressed by how McCormick turned his invention into this hugely profitable business. He even mentions how people in France recognized him as a huge contributor to the world because of what he made possible with the harvester.
And what really struck Rockefeller was this belief that McCormick understood the real meaning of luck. McCormick, in his view, he didn't just stumble into success. He actively, positioned himself to take advantage of his innovation. And this leads to Rockefeller's main argument in this letter, which is that luck, it's not just something you're given, right? It's something you can actually create through careful planning.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because his personal motto was, I do not live by God-given luck, but I do so by planning luck. And he believed that a well-thought-out plan could actually change the odds. And he uses his own experiences in the oil industry as a perfect example.
Right. He talks about, the early days of oil refining. It was like the Wild West. There was this fierce competition, and prices were plummeting. It was driving a lot of refiners to the edge of bankruptcy, basically. And while lower prices might sound like a good thing, right, for the average person, it was actually creating this huge instability in the entire industry. And what Rockefeller saw was that this wasn't just a crisis, it was an opportunity to bring some order, to establish a more stable foundation for everyone. And his plan was to consolidate these struggling businesses under his leadership.
He approached it very strategically, almost like it was a military campaign, didn't he? I mean, he even called Cleveland. He said it was his first battlefield. And his goal there was to overcome more than 20 competitors in that city alone.
Yeah.
And once he established his dominance there, he moved on. He expanded to other cities, to build what he called, an oil industry in a new order.
Yeah.
He saw the big picture for sure.
Oh, absolutely. He had this knack for seeing potential, where other people just saw problems. He recognized that, when 90% of refiners in Cleveland were facing ruin, that was actually the perfect time to make strategic acquisitions. And some people might question the ethics of that, but Rockefeller really saw it as, a necessary action in this competitive environment. It was a battlefield, like he said. And his ultimate aim was to build a stronger industry, something more stable, more beneficial in the long run.
And his main target wasn't some, weak little struggling company. It was his strongest competitor, Clark Payne. And he even talks about how he approached Mr. Oliver Payne, the largest shareholder, who also happened to be, an old friend of his from middle school. And he convinced him, of this vision, his vision for a large, stable oil company, and invited him to be a partner. And he paid what he admitted was an inflated price, $400,000 for Clark Payne.
Right. And he acknowledged that, financially speaking, at that time, Clark Payne probably wasn't worth quite that much. But the acquisition, it served this crucial strategic purpose. It instantly made him the biggest oil refiner in the entire world. And it sent this powerful message to all the other refiners in Cleveland. And within 2 months, 22 of his competitors decided to join Standard Oil. It was a total victory for him.
Yeah, and thinking back on it, he realized that, if he had just sort of resigned himself to the tough situation, followed the path of a lot of others, he might have been the one who ended up defeated. But by being proactive, by planning his moves carefully, he essentially planned his luck.
Right.
And the core of this idea is having a good plan, right? And having a clear design that takes into account your goals, like what you want to achieve or become, and also your resources, what you have to work with, your status, your money, your relationships, your own abilities. I mean, it's a very, very forward-thinking approach.
It is. And then moving on to letter 2, we kind of shift gears a little bit. This one's called Losing Work Means Losing Happiness. And it's a shorter letter, almost like a philosophical reflection. And it starts with this kind of dark but funny fable about an unemployed man who imagined that, hell was this place where there was no work to be done, only to realize, of course, that he was already living in that hell.
Yeah, that punchline, it kind of hits you, right? Yeah. And Rockefeller uses it to really drive home this belief that he had, that losing your work, losing your job is almost like losing your happiness. And he sadly notes that this realization, it often comes too late for a lot of people. They only figure it out after they've already lost their job,
It's true. And then he shifts his focus to those folks who are, ambitious. They want to do something great, but they're maybe a little bit too picky, about the work they're willing to do. They're always waiting for the perfect employer or the perfect job. And Rockefeller's argument is that, at the end of the day, employers, they value employees who are punctual, who are honest, and who, show up ready to work hard. That's what really matters. And he believed that salary increases and promotions, those are earned by those who are loyal, who are enthusiastic, and who are willing to put in the time and the effort.
Yeah, and he uses this great analogy here. He compares it to shooting a gun, right? And he's saying, the longer you spend aiming, the longer you wait for absolutely perfect conditions, the less likely you are to actually pull the trigger, to take action. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes you just gotta get started, take that first step, rather than being paralyzed by this idea of, perfection.
Exactly. And letter 3 introduces this really cool concept called the workbench attitude. And Rockefeller suggests that our attitude towards our work, like our fundamental approach to it, plays a huge role in our overall happiness, whether we're satisfied or not. And he illustrates this with a simple story, but it's really profound. It's about these 3 stonemasons, and they're all doing the exact same job, right?
So the first stonemason, he sees his work as just pure punishment. He's just chiseling stone to go home. He's always counting down the hours until he can leave. And, he's complaining about being tired all the time.
Right. And the second stonemason, he sees his work as a necessary burden. He's got to do it to feed his family. But, he's not really getting any joy out of it. He's just doing what he has to do.
And then there's the third stonemason.
Yeah.
And this guy, he proudly declares that he's creating a work of art.
Right.
And he's finding, deep meaning in the process of what he's doing. And Rockefeller argues that, in a sense, we all kind of create our own heaven and hell, right?
Yeah.
Based on the meaning that we choose to give to our work, the work that we find meaningful. That's what brings us happiness. It gives us a sense of fulfillment. And it doesn't really matter, what the work is or even the results that you achieve. It's all about your attitude.
It's so true. And he contrasts that with, the experience of disliking your work. And he says, that just makes everything harder. Even the simplest tasks feel like a huge burden, and you end up exhausted even without putting in a lot of effort. It's a great example of the power of mindset.
Yeah, if you approach your work with a sense of purpose, with, the feeling that it's actually valuable, it can transform your whole experience.
Absolutely. And that leads us to letter 4, which is dated December 24th, 1897. And this one's all about the power of action. He starts off by quoting this wise saying. He says, "Education covers many aspects, but it does not teach you anything." And what he's getting at is that, all that theoretical knowledge, all that philosophy, it's useless if you don't actually apply it in the real world.
Right, and this kind of echoes his earlier point about planning your luck.
Yeah.
You can have the most brilliant ideas, but if you don't act on them, they're just ideas. They're not going to get you anywhere.
Yeah.
He really believes that even imperfect ideas, if you put them into action, if you develop them, they're far more valuable than those perfect plans that just stay, on paper.
He says there's no real secret to success. It's not about, finding some magic formula. It's about taking consistent action, taking those steps that move you closer to your goals. And he contrasts this with the way that a lot of ordinary people behave. They tend to be passive, they talk a lot, but they don't actually do much. And they're always finding excuses to delay taking action. And ultimately, they fail to achieve their goals because they never actually do anything.
He even mentions a compliment he got from Mr. Gates,
Yeah.
who described him as an active and spontaneous individual, which he was. He was clearly very proud of that description. And while he acknowledges that, planning is important, it can never replace actually doing something. He uses that classic golf analogy. You can't reach the second hole until you play the first. It's just common sense.
Absolutely. And his message here is very clear. He says, action solves everything. Without it, nothing happens. And he talks about this very human tendency to resist change, to, cling to the familiar, to the status quo, even if we're not happy with it. It's like this fear of the unknown, right? And he emphasizes that truly smart people, they're the ones who make things happen. They don't wait for things to happen to them.
He also addresses the feeling of being overwhelmed, right? When you have so many things to do, you don't know where to start. And he talks about the importance of focusing on wise actions that bring meaningful results rather than trying to do everything at once. And he has this personal motto that he shares. He says, only takes unfair treatment for emergencies, which means basically, be proactive. Don't wait for perfect conditions. Just get started.
And he compares passivity and proactivity to habits. He says they're like these deep-seated habits, like, ropes that lead you either to success, to the top of the mountain, or to failure, to the bottom. And he emphasizes that we need to develop that habit of acting now, being decisive, being proactive, avoiding distractions, being determined, and not waiting for everything to be perfect before we take that first step. And he says, developing that habit, it takes work and takes consistent effort to let those good habits take root.
All right, so letter 5, this one dives into using borrowed strength. And this is where we really start to see some of Rockefeller's, his financial and strategic genius coming into play. He describes this potential threat, a 110-mile pipeline that could have given his competitor, a guy named Benson, control over the very important New York oil refining industry and the Bradford oil field, which would have been, bad news for Rockefeller because it would have directly impacted his existing markets.
And his goal, his main objective was to protect his market share, right? But he didn't want to push Benson into a corner. He didn't want to create a situation where Benson might, lash out or do something unpredictable. So his first move was to try to buy Benson's stock, to just buy him out. But Benson refused. And this is where Rockefeller he steps back and he reflects on something that he noticed, that often the most difficult problems, the ones that seem, impossible to solve, they actually create the best opportunities for really creative solutions.
Right. And this leads him to talk about borrowing money. He challenges this conventional wisdom that debt is always bad. He suggests that it can actually be a very powerful tool for creating opportunities, as long as you're not, just using it as a last resort when you're desperate. It's about being strategic with it.
Yeah. And he says something really bold here. He says, borrowing money is to create good luck. And he gives a specific example of using mortgages, borrowing money against land to achieve market dominance. And he even mentions his own, his huge debts, the fact that he mortgaged his own businesses in Cleveland as part of his strategy to gain control of the industry in that region.
He ends the letter with this really memorable statement. He says, "Life is a constant mortgage." And it's like he's saying, we're constantly taking calculated risks in the present in the hopes of future gains. And it's like, isn't it worth it to take a risk if the potential reward is big enough?
Right. And then moving on to letter 6, this one's called The Value of Honesty. And this is where we see another side of Rockefeller, another really important part of his business philosophy. He talks about this time when he was expanding in Cleveland and he needed to secure more loans from the banks to fuel his growth.
And he specifically mentions the support of a banker named Mr. Stillman, who basically vouched for him, in front of all these other bank directors. He told them that they could trust Rockefeller.
Yeah.
He's a man of his word. And because of that, they lent him the money.
And Rockefeller credits this to his reputation, for being honest, for having integrity. He says, "I subdued the bankers with my honesty." He sees honesty not just as a moral virtue, but as a strategy, a way to earn trust, and that trust helped him through tough times and ultimately, paved the way for his success.
He ends this letter with a message to his son saying that the bravery and integrity, that combination, that's the surest path to a good life.
Letter 7 gets into kind of a heavier topic. It's called The Horrors of Spiritual Bankruptcy. And this is a more introspective letter where he makes this really strong statement. He says, the most horrifying thing is spiritual bankruptcy. And he also talks about failure. He says, failure is a good thing as long as it doesn't become a habit. He doesn't see failure as the end, but it's something you can learn from.
But then he introduces this kind of paradoxical idea. He says, when you take advantage of opportunities, you are depriving others of opportunities in order to guarantee yourself.
Yeah.
And it's like he's acknowledging this competitive nature of the business world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you have to make tough choices that might impact others.
And he warns against letting the fear of failure, become your main motivator. Mm-hmm. He says that, that just leads to laziness, to powerlessness. Instead, he saw failure as a bitter but ultimately kind of vitalizing experience. Like he says, it's like a glass of spirits that can, strengthen you for the next challenge.
Yeah. And he actually shares a story about an early business setback he had that involved this bad bean contract. And the situation was made worse by a storm and also some dishonest suppliers. He took a big loss on that one. But he talks about how he refused to let himself get depressed about it, to dwell on the failure. He knew that would just hold him back from achieving his goals.
He reiterates this principle that, there's no free lunch in life, and that just maintaining the status quo, just, staying where you are is impossible. If you want to make progress, you have to make decisions, you have to be willing to take risks. And he talks about how he, once again, he borrowed money and he used advertising, newspaper ads to offer these really good deals on agricultural products. And he managed to turn a profit despite that earlier bean incident.
He goes back to this main point that, everyone hates to fail. It's natural. But if you let that fear of failure control you, if you let it become your main motivator, it'll make you lazy. It'll make you miss out on opportunities. He compares the business world to a jungle. It's eat or be eaten out there.
And he ends this letter with this powerful statement. He says, evading risk is almost a guarantee of bankruptcy. And he's not just talking about financial bankruptcy. He's talking about, failing to achieve your potential, failing to live a full life. And he ends on an encouraging note, expressing his faith that his son will be able to overcome any setbacks, to learn from his mistakes, and to ultimately come out even stronger.
Letter 8, dated February 12, 1909. This one is called The Indomitable Spirit. And it has a much more, optimistic, almost celebratory tone. He starts off by saying, a great day, because he's commemorating Abraham Lincoln. He really admired Lincoln, calling him a great and rare soul who deserves, our gratitude.
He says that no one is greater than Lincoln. And he highlights all of Lincoln's, amazing achievements, freeing the slaves, ending racial hatred, uniting the country. And he emphasizes the lessons that we can learn from Lincoln's life, which are persistent determination and unwavering courage.
He says the best way to honor Lincoln is to try to be like him, to have that spirit of perseverance. And he describes Lincoln as the indomitable embodiment who is not frightened by difficulties. And to illustrate this, he talks about Lincoln's own, challenging beginnings, how he was born into poverty, how he was driven from his home as a young man, and all the, early failures he had in his career, like trying to be a store owner, losing elections.
And he contrasts this with the idea of giving up. He says, only giving up will result in failure. And then he says something even stronger. He says, there is nothing in the world that can replace perseverance. And he makes it clear that unless you give up, you will not be beaten.
And then he makes this really smart observation. He says, too many people overestimate what they lack, but underestimate what they have. It's a good reminder to focus on your strengths, to focus on the resources you do have, rather than, dwelling on what you don't have.
And he offers this advice. He says that every step you take on the path to your goals, it gives you enough time to secure your footing before you aim for the next level. It's not a time to rest. It's a time to prepare for the next step. He encourages us to keep fighting, to keep going, even when we're tired or discouraged. Like a boxer, you got to keep fighting even when you're exhausted. And he stresses that everyone has this unlimited potential, but that potential is useless unless you use it, unless you actually put in the work.
He says, great opportunities do not seek external validation. However, we must work hard to grasp them. Which, reminds me of his point about planning your luck. You have to be ready to seize those opportunities when they arise. And he talks about the importance of striking while the iron is hot, and perseverance and hard work. He ends the letter with this encouraging thought that every no you hear, it brings you closer to a yes, and that, the darkest part of the night is always just before the dawn.
Letter 9 focuses on the power of belief. And here, Rockefeller, he shares this very strong personal conviction. He says, I never believed that failure is the mother of success. I believe that faith is the father of success. And that's a really key distinction. He's talking about the power of belief, of having faith in yourself and your abilities.
He goes on to say that victory is a habit and failure is also a habit. He's saying, to be successful, you have to establish a pattern of winning, of achieving your goals. And he explains that his own motivation comes from this deep confidence. He says, confidence motivates me to succeed. And that believing in yourself, believing that you can achieve great things, that's a driving force behind all great achievements.
He says, believing in success is a basic and absolutely necessary element possessed by successful people. It's something that those who fail tend to lack. And he tells these stories about, talking to people who experienced business failures. And he noticed this pattern, this subconscious disbelief in their own abilities. Like, they'd say things like, I didn't really think it would work, or I just had this bad feeling about it. They didn't really believe they could do it.
And he warns against this attitude of just trying, without really expecting to succeed. He calls disbelief this negative force that creates doubt, that undermines your efforts.
And he lists several things that contribute to failure. Suspicion, disbelief, this tendency to expect failure subconsciously, and just a lack of desire to succeed. He says, if you doubt it, you will fail. If you believe in victory, you will definitely succeed. It's like this self-fulfilling prophecy.
And he explains that people who move forward with this confidence, with this belief in their own worth, they attract greater rewards. They have this belief that they can handle anything. And he talks about faith being like this guiding light. It illuminates the path. It gives you courage. It makes you optimistic.
And he stresses the importance of constantly building your confidence, replacing those thoughts of failure with beliefs in success. Like telling yourself, I will win. I am just as good as them. I can do this. He says the first step to success is believing in yourself. Believing that you will succeed.
And he encourages the listener, you listening right now, by saying you are better than you think you are. And he points out that successful people, they're not, superhumans. They're ordinary people who believe in themselves. He says, never sell yourself short.
And he makes this point that focusing on small goals leads to small results. But if you set big goals, if you aim high, you can achieve great things. And often it's not even that much harder to think big, to have those big ambitions. He says the people who reach the top, they're constantly pushing themselves. They're constantly growing. And that's what leads to respect, to recognition, to, material rewards, a sense of importance, a better life.
And he concludes by saying that success requires you to have this positive mindset, to believe in yourself, to believe in your ability to achieve great things. And while, sometimes our beliefs might be wrong, it's always better to start with this positive belief and adjust as you go.
Letter 10 is an interesting one. It's called loyalty to oneself. And it starts with this almost cryptic statement. He says, I can deceive the enemy, but I will never deceive myself. It's like he's talking about the importance of being true to yourself, even in the face of competition, even when you're dealing with, people who might be trying to take advantage of you.
And then he says this kind of cynical thing about human nature. He says, people who ask me to treat them with sincerity want to reap benefits from me. It's like, he's not naive. He understands that people often have ulterior motives, but then he offers a more optimistic thought. He says, what fate gives us is not the wine of disappointment, but the cup of opportunity. It's like, even when things go wrong, there's always a chance to turn it around.
And he makes this bold claim about human motivation. He says that everyone, apart from God, is ultimately pursuing profit, and that even our relationships, they're part of this protracted life game for profit. And in this game, everyone is a potential enemy, including, he says, our own weaknesses, our own limitations.
He then repeats that principle from the beginning of the letter. I can deceive the enemy, but I never deceive myself. And he adds that he doesn't feel guilty about fighting back against those who try to harm him. And then he talks about this label that people started giving him, this praise of being greedy, which, came as his wealth and power grew.
And he dismisses this praise as a way to discredit him, to try to take away from his achievements. He says, I do not like money. What I like is making money. And he explains that he doesn't see it as his job to change human nature. So he's not going to waste his time trying to convince people that he's not greedy. He's just going to keep doing what he's doing.
He even says that he'll let the jealous people stay jealous. He knows that if his wealth disappeared, all that praise would vanish too.
He says a true gentleman, he doesn't argue with ignorant people, but he certainly doesn't respect their ignorance. And he makes this argument that no society has ever been built without some level of ambition, some level of what you might call greed. He suggests that the people who criticize him for being greedy are probably just as ambitious, just as eager to hold on to what they have.
He tells a story about Mr. Archibald, who described him as a racehorse, sprinting towards the finish line. And he admits that, yeah, he is ambitious. He does have that drive. And then he shares this really interesting anecdote about a business school teacher who said something really controversial. He said, there's nothing wrong with being greedy. I think being greedy is a good thing. Everyone can be greedy. From the beginning of greed, there will be hope. And this caused a huge uproar among the students.
And he explains that while the word greedy might sound bad, it goes against our moral sense. But in the real world, the business world, the world of, competition and survival, there's a certain truth to it. The strong, the ambitious, the ones who want more, they're the ones who often succeed.
And he defines greed in this context as this desire for more. This desire to monopolize, to have control. And he asks, who hasn't felt that? He suggests that all those ideas about morality and dignity, that's just a facade. Underneath it all, we're all driven by this desire for more.
He argues that as long as people want fame, fortune, a better life, as long as happiness isn't just, handed to everyone, there's going to be this element of greed. It's part of human nature.
And he talks about his own journey from being this $5 a week bookkeeper to becoming one of the richest men in the world. And he says, it is hard work. Opportunities are only reserved for hardworking people. It's not just about luck. It's about putting in the effort.
And he ends the letter with this very sincere declaration. He says that all his wealth, it was earned honestly through hard work, through intelligence, and that ultimately it was a reward from God. He believes that God gave him this wealth because he knew he would use it to benefit others.
Letter 12, dated August 11th, 1918, is called The Danger of Arrogance. It starts with this thought-provoking statement, hell is full of good people. And then he follows that up with, arrogance usually leads to downfall. He's setting the stage for a discussion about the dangers of being too self-assured, too confident.
And he says something interesting about his own relationship with money. He says, I do not like money. What I like is making money. It's not about having it. It's about the process of earning it. And then he reveals his competitive side. He says, my belief is to reach the goal before others. He's a very competitive person.
And he tells this story about this little incident that happened when he was driving to play golf.
Yeah.
This young man in a fancy car cut him off. And this just, sparked this competitive fire in him. So he sped up and left the guy in the dust. And it's like a metaphor for his whole approach to business. He always wants to be the best. He always wants to win.
And then he moves on to a much bigger challenge. The Pennsylvania Railroad Company, they were trying to gain control of the oil refining industry by merging pipelines. And this was a direct threat to Rockefeller's position. And he identifies this guy, Mr. Potts, the president of Empire.